Problem of evil and suffering.
Introduction to the problem of evil. Irenaeus argued that God wants us to learn and to grow in spiritual maturity and therefore gave us challenges, hardships to face, out of love, so that we could choose to have relationship with Him. Augustine argued that God created a perfect world, but evil entered the world because some of the angels made bad choices by rebelling against God and then fell from heaven. They corrupted humanity and caused Adam and Eve to sin, and it was so significant that it caused original sin. John Hick followed an Irenaean line of thought with his soul-making theodicy. He argued that the challenges we face in this world are meant to help us reach a free relationship with God. He also thought that this relationship is available and inevitable regardless of religious faith. Different presentations of the problem evil, a logical problem. Biggest challenge is that if there's a God who is omnipotent and omnibenevolent, why does evil and suffering still exist? Criticism of religion: wouldn't an all-loving God want to prevent and eliminate evil? The God in the Abrahamic faiths cannot be omnipotent and omnibenevolent. Hume says, is He willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then He is impotent. Is He able but not willing? Then He is malevolent. Is He both willing and able? Whence then is evil? The best-known modern proponent of this argument is J. L. Mackie. Inconsistent triad: accept that God is perfectly good, accept that God is all-powerful, accept that evil and suffering exist. You cannot possibly accept all three without facing logical fallacy/contradiction. If there is an all-powerful God, then He could have made any kind of world, a world with no suffering and no death, yet He chose to make this world. This evidently shows that there's an inconsistency. This argument is a priori, as it argues on the basis of logic alone without the need for experience to show that God cannot be all omnipotent and omnibenevolent and still evil exists in the world.
Different presentations of the problem of evil, evidential problem. This argument is a posteriori. It takes evidence of our experiences to show that there is an inconsistency with the nature of God and evil still existing in the world. The personal and second-hand suffering and wrongdoing that occurs points to the problem of evil. It is argued that there may be a God, but He doesn't all these qualities we associate with God, or possibly God doesn't exist. Exponent of the evidential argument is J.S. Mill. He argued that the natural world is full of evidence of evil. He argues against those who use a posteriori arguments, in particular Paley, in support of the existence of a good God. He claims that in fact the evidence entails a sadistic, misogynistic God. Nature impales men, breaks them as if on the wheel, casts them to be devoured by wild beasts, burns them to death. Mill's argument is that evidence in an all-powerful creator is not supported. He argues against the teleological argument. Mill's argument means that we cannot look to God for moral guidance or worship Him for His goodness. Use this to justify why utilitarianism is secular. Responses to the problem of evil, theodicy. Natural and moral evil. Philosophers sometimes draw a distinction between natural and moral evil. Natural evil refers to those parts of existence which cause suffering but do not result from human wrongdoing. For example, earthquakes. Moral evil refers to evil resulting from humanity's choice to do bad rather than good. For example, war, bullying, greed. It also refers to the failure to do good when given the opportunity. For example, leaving old people to be lonely on Christmas. This distinction is helpful in discussion because although it's very easy to blame humans in order to defend God's nature, it is difficult in fact to blame humanity for natural evil, and this encourages to find explanations for natural evil. This distinction, however, is not helpful under two premises. When the fall is taken as an event so significant that it corrupted the whole of the natural order, therefore all evil is considered moral evil. All evil is considered natural evil because we are made in a way that we can feel mental and physical pain, and if we were made differently then perhaps we could not have the capacity for suffering. For those who reject the idea of God, this distinction is not necessary because people continue to suffer regardless, but for these people there isn't a conundrum to answer. Life simply has its ups and downs, where some are fortunate and others suffer, but this is down to chance. Augustine's theodicy. He presented a Christian theodicy, one which disagreed with the thinking of Plato, that everything in our world was an imperfect reflection of the ideal realm of forms. He did not believe that God could make anything imperfect. This is because in the creation story in Genesis the Bible confirmed that God saw all that he made, and it was very good. When Augustine was a member of Manichaeism, he believed that the universe was in a cosmic battle between the forces of good and evil. When people did bad thing, it was due to the evil forces winning, and so people could not be held accountable for their actions as they were at total mercy of these supernatural beings. When Augustine became a Christian, he rejected these ideas as there could not be any power that could rival God. And so his theodicy had to rule out any possibility that evil in the world exists because God made it. Augustine came to the conclusion that evil is not a real, actual quality in its own right. It is what he called a privatio boni, privation or absence of good. Augustine believes that variety is part of the goodness and perfection of the created world. There are so many different plants and animals and different types of people, and then above them are angels in a hierarchy. Each part of creation is good upon its own merit. It is inevitable that if the world is to be rich and varied, then that its constituents would be different. Difference is a good thing, and it's necessary that some creatures would be more limited than others. Augustine believed that evil first came into the world through the fall of angels. He said that angels were originally perfect, but some received less grace than others by variety. Grace meant less assistance given by God in their attempts to be holy. Angels then fell away from grace as a misuse of their free will. They tried to become lords of their own being by rivaling God. The same thing happened to Adam and Eve as representatives of humanity, where they were tempted by Satan. All evil in world has followed on from here, and Augustine believes we are all ontologically bad, free will the cause of our doing evil. Thy just judgment is the cause of our having to suffer the consequences. Original sin disrupted the whole world, and it even affected the natural world, causing earthquakes, droughts and plagues. This theodicy involves some creative interpretations of the story of the Garden of Eden.
Discussing the problem of evil. Is Augustine's view of the origin of moral and natural evil enough to spare God from the blame of evil in the world? Main strengths of Augustine's theodicy. God never tolerates evil in any way and wants to have a world that doesn't have evil in it. Whereas other theodicies suggests that evil's purpose leads to good, but Augustine never allows the idea that God wants us to have anything to do with evil. A religious group called the Christian Scientists take up this idea of the non-reality of evil by explaining it as some kind of illusion, and Mary Eddy said that sickness etc. would disappear if they were understood to be nothingness. Criticisms of Augustinian theodicy. Evil seems to be more than just a privation of good. E.g., deliberate cruelty towards a child, which seems to be more powerful and harmful than just a lack of goodness. The view that we can deny pain and suffering is extremely difficult, as the pain we experience is real enough and has real symptoms. His view gives no explanation as to why some of the angels had too little grace until they disobeyed God. The theodicy seems to suggest that God did not think ahead. This would go against the nature of God. Friedrich Schleiermacher argued it's impossible to find a cause or motive for angels to sin unless they were created imperfectly in the first place. Evil would have had to have come out of nowhere unless God made it that way, and this raises some serious questions about the nature of God. The question of God's omniscience. If God created the world knowing in advance that evil would happen even if it was our choice, it still begs the question about why he chose to.
The theodicy of Irenaeus. Irenaeus lived when Christianity was new, and he helped to form the New Testament. There was severe persecution of Christians, and this led him to want to understand how a God of love and power could allow such suffering. Irenaeus did not attempt to show that there was a privation of evil, he admitted that God allowed it to continue. His argument was that God allows evil and suffering to have a place in the world deliberately so that we can grow as human beings and form a free, mature relationship with God. Irenaeus believed that evil had to be evil in the world in order for us to appreciate good. Many of the good things we take for granted only exist as good because there are other things in the world which are not good. Good is a qualitative, comparative judgment, so there has to less good things to compare it to. He also believed that evil in the world exists in order for us to develop as free individuals. If we always got what we wanted, we would never learn anything. We grow individuals through the problems that we encounter. John Hick, Richard Swinburne and Irenaeus all believe that when God made people in his own image, this had to include giving them free will. If God had not have given humans free will, they would not have been in his image. Irenaeus made a distinction between the image and the likeness of God. Although we were created in the image of God, we have to grow into the likeness of God. In order to become the likeness of God, we have to develop and mature and reach our potential. Kant in his Ethic argues that we can only act morally if we have the freedom to do so. It is not good if we are forced to do so, nor is it admirable to do good if we have no other option. Irenaeus thought that part of being good is an effort of will. Make a conscious effort to opt for the right choices and reject the wrong ones. A question asked is, why did God not simply create us in his image right from the beginning? He responds to this by using the analogy of a mother feeding a newborn baby. The baby does not eat an adult diet as it's not developed enough. Humanity is not capable of being in the likeness of God in this world, it only occurs after death. It was an essential part of Irenaeus' theodicy that every had life after death, as they believed that the afterlife was not an immediate end to a person's journey but allowed them to continue their journey on a different spiritual plane.
Can the need to create a veil of soul-making justify the existence or the extent of evils? Main strengths of Irenaean theodicy. When Christians respond to the concept of suffering, it gives all the pain a purpose and influences them to work through it. Weaknesses of Irenaeus' theodicy. Some people suffer a lot more than others. Does this mean that God wants more spiritual maturity for some than others? Some people are unable to benefit from the pain, but they still experience it. Animal suffering is too hard to explain using this view if it believed that the human soul is unique and special. A possible response is that animal cruelty teaches us to be compassionate, but the problem is animals suffer and there's no one to learn from it. Some people very evidently seem to be made worse from their suffering. It can make them act irrationally and drive them to mental illness. E.g., a soldier returning from war with PTSD. John Hick's version is arguably controversial. If Jesus died on the cross for the salvation of the elect Christians, then why should non-Christians be able to have salvation? It makes the idea of the gospel superfluous and pointless. Hick's optimistic view that everyone will eventually be good contradicts the idea that we are free to choose, as the destination of everyone is the same. Dostoevsky argued that even if the lessons taught to us were valuable, it would still have been better if God didn't create the world in the first place. He says in his novel that the price we are expected to pay for our freedom is too high. Hick takes a consequentialist view when arguing his theodicy, but Kant argues that humans should be treated as ends and never means. D. Z. Phillips argues that it is not right to suggest that God allows evil, but he actively created it into his plan, and this would suggest an evil God.
John Hick's Irenaean soul-making theodicy. Hick describes the world as a veil of soul-making where things that happen to us are for our own good. Hick took this idea of soul-making and used it to develop Irenaeus' theodicy. By Hick's time, people had accepted Darwinism and so rejected Augustine's approach that the fall was a real historic event. Hick had lived through the atrocities of the 20th century, for example the World Wars and the Holocaust, and so had to understand why God would allow these things to happen. Hick agreed with Irenaeus that evil and suffering is not an unfortunate accident that God failed to anticipate. For Hick, Augustine's theodicy has too many contradictions and it causes more problems than it solves. According to Hick, God gave us a world where we have the best circumstances to choose a free and loving relationship with Him. This includes struggles and hardships and epistemic distance, gap of knowledge between us and God. God deliberately remains partially hidden and gives us an ambiguous world so we genuinely make free choices. If God revealed Himself, there would be no choice but to have faith in Him. The world then has to exist with uncertainty that God exists because God wants us to have the freedom to choose Him. Hick's theodicy depends on a belief in the afterlife, as present hardships are only justified if there is promise of a better life after death. For example, if a young person dies young after a painful illness and there is not something better, then it cannot be seen for the good. Hick believes that for this theodicy to work there has to be belief in some kind of afterlife. He also believes that regardless of the faith you are subject to salvation. Link this to ideas of universalism, pluralism.
Is it possible to defend monotheism successfully in the face of evil? Some people might argue that, even if evil does provide strong evidence against the evidence for the existence of God, there's even stronger evidence for God actually existing. There is not just evil the world but goodness, beauty and love. It could be argued that the good still outweighs the bad, and this pushes the probability of God existing. It is argued that we should not expect to know God's reasoning. It should be enough for us to know there's an all-powerful, all-loving God who does not make mistakes. It's argued that theism is about faith and not about the rules or deductive logic.
Thank you for watching. If you want this channel to upload more videos on A-level religious studies, please like this video and subscribe this channel. To purchase notes or if you have any questions, please see description.